Welcome to the SDS Player Piano Music Box project. This is a project I did to take a break from programming modules and a change of pace. This is to be a Christmas gift from my parents, but also an experiment in self-stimulated music composition using the Accord Melisma core and the MIDI recordability of the Accord Sequarallel, which is an upcoming module soon to be released. The Melisma in Eurorack modular form was released early in the spring of 2020. It bridges the gap between modular chord methods and true chord compositions in music, following established classical music rules for auto-generation of accompaniment and piano keying. For more on the Melisma, there are many demo and tutorial videos here on my YouTube channel. The Sequarallel module, on the other hand, is a full MIDI to CV sequencer and tracker capable of recording existing MIDI songs or building a composition by adding sequences and recording from MIDI controllers or keyboards. Therefore, it must have a decent size onboard memory, which is integrated into this project. Back to the Melisma. For the Player Piano Music Box, most of the Melisma's modular I/O has been bypassed as it's not needed. The inputs, both trigger and ADCs, have been replaced by internal LFOs, triggers, clocks, and sequencers to mimic regular use of the Melisma in a modular rack. Some circuitry similar to the Sequarallel's memory setup was added, and voila, the schematic for the music box is born. Broken down, there's the Atmega 2560, which is the heart of the Melisma, a USB to serial, a permanent MIDI input opto isolator, even though it will only be used to record songs initially into this piano, and the SRAM and fairly large flash chip on the SPI bus. LED driver MAX 7219, as there's quite a few LEDs on the unit, a power management circuit, a basic UI, an OLED display, and in the original, a bank of MOSFETs to drive keyboard solenoids to animate the keys with music. This was changed due to an order of micromotors being returned to China for whatever reason. Neither module has a MIDI synth, so I used the challenging 0.4mm pitched SAM 2695 breakout I made in a previous video, as it has a very good reproduction of the GM sound set. Feeding into a pair of TBA 820 2-watt amps, which was originally to be a LM386 1-watt amps, but I wanted more power as my parents use hearing aids, and louder is probably better. First I had to decide on the case that would house everything, and originally it was to be a horizontal keyboard-like shape. After some thought involving solenoids though, I decided to go with an upright piano so solenoids could be mounted vertically, or to leave it open as an option. I'm glad I went this way because there were some mechanical difficulties to come. The original key animation design was to have 15 microvibrator motors actuate the keys with a limited rotation and spring return. These tiny motors, one shown in violet, are quite powerful and well capable of pulling down a spring-loaded key. But when I realized Canada Post had returned them, probably because they look like batteries or maybe they were placed in the wrong post box, whatever, I decided to use relay-like solenoids. The solenoids would be machine screws with 18 feet of wire wrapped around them, each, to make 15 little electromagnets. Problem is, I'm not great at understanding the dynamics of electromagnets. I know it's bizarre. Everything I know, I just don't know a lot about that. I don't have a huge amount of experience with it either. Here's the layout of solenoids that, when alone, were strong enough to pull the screw over, thus pulling down the key. There were two problems with this method though. The first was power consumption. I made a PC board with large electrolytic caps and power resistors to offer an unmonitored surge to pull the key down initially. After some tests, this idea worked well and reduced the current required. But the other problem that emerged was a showstopper. The electromagnets seem more interesting in attracting each other than the screw in front of it. Looking back, it was a duh moment. I should have used core and rod style solenoids vertically, which would have worked. But time was running out and there were only a few days left before the Christmas shipping cutoff. And with the pandemic, there's even more uncertainty there, so... Anyway, fast rewind to the initial case design effort. Because of the small size the keys needed to be, I had to design and 3D print them. This was a bit more involved than I originally thought. I've torn down lots of keyboards, large and small, in the past, and you don't ever really appreciate the complexity of the measurements and stuff that goes into something until you have to start from scratch. At first I was going to make all of the white keys on one single layout and all the black keys on another that interlocked, but was worried about PLA filament and how flexible it isn't, plus getting the amount of force required just right, and also eventually they would start breaking off, as cheap stuff like that always does. So I decided to go with real springs and a rod for all of the keys to pivot on. This proved to be trouble-free once I got the spacing right. 2 types of spacers were made for that. I did some research into upright pianos and how they're shaped. Even though I've played uprights on and off for most of my adult life, I never really looked at the way they're put together. After all, a piano is a piano, right? This was a bit daunting as it has to appear like a piano, but only have 15 keys and be cued all at once. I wanted the keyboard carrier to be easily removable for the construction process, plus there needs to be a control panel without getting too ugly or complex. There have to be volume controls, one for instruments, the other for drums, an encoder to select song moods that you want to hear more of, a display, and large push switches. The big switches are made to be momentary, classic looking, and simple, with colors. The gray shaft represents a long 6x6 momentary switch we use in many of our modules. Wrapped around the shaft is a small spring that you don't see here. The PC board for the switches mounts in the slots. This was added to the back of the face panel. Looking at the back of the panel, with the switch carrier now integrated, there's some standoffs added. This pair is to mount the volume and drum level pots, while this pair is for the main processor boards. The encoder will hold yet another PC board in place for the LEDs above it, and a distribution point from the maxed 7219 LED driver to all of the overhead LEDs, which are wired. Looking at the lower half is a mount and grill for the bass reflex speaker. I tried printing this from flexible TPE rubber and making a little coil and magnet setup, which actually worked. But the TPE was too rigid, so, it worked as a speaker but didn't resonate in the lower bass frequencies at all. So I scrapped that in lieu of a parasitic cone of a regular speaker. This adds another dimension to the sound in any case. Finally, there's the foot pedals, which will actuate a push button to turn on or off the keyboard animation to save batteries mostly. So finally, the case is coming together. Printed off the decorative curves and such for the front panel and supports. It was just a kind of a artsy-fartsy thing, and I think it came out pretty good. Some 3D printed spindles cored with stainless rod to be strong and made them look like wood, and then the base reinforcements, which was the same kind of design, so it would all match. The side panels will house some nice speakers I bought from AliExpress. They have surprisingly good range for their size, not even 2 inches across, and the highs are wonderful with the Sam MIDI synth. They sound just really crisp. The back insert panel needs to have nickel metal hydride battery housing that's attached. Enough space for 10 batteries, 1.2 volts times 10 is 12 volts. So one case holds 8 and the other only holds 2 AAs. Originally the batteries were to be mounted in the lower part of the case behind the center speaker, but once the solenoid disaster happened, the space had to be used for a fix. I made the capacitor PC board and had all the solenoids in place, and following tests made it exceedingly clear that this relay-style electromagnetic setup was certainly not going to work at all. I came close to cobbing the whole project at this point. I was already behind schedule with the mailing day fast approaching, and a major supposition was proven flawed to the core. There was no way it was going to work. No way I could make it work. So I redesigned it using some motors I had laying around in my junk box to drive the keys in groups. I had to choose motors that could take PWM up to 12 volts without burning out and have a lot of torque. I had about 20 to choose from. I don't even remember where they came from, and some needed bearings and bushings oiled and such, and contacts cleaned. But in the end, they all worked. Did you know many of the hobby and toy motors have the same size shaft? I didn't. It made things way simpler. Some very strong nylon threads were used, one from each key, to motors on spindles I printed. So there they are, mounted into place with a new little driver board on top. And there's still enough room for the batteries. Yay. I had to modify the back panel a bit, but they fit right in there. See, it is possible to use Maya to do a 3D CAD design. Some people say it's not, but I know Maya, so that's what I'm using. All of this construction made doing up the circuit board seem comparatively simple. For the Atmega 2560 processor, I used one of my convenient 100-pin breakouts. This was in turn stacked onto the motherboard. I forgot to get pictures of that whole thing, but it's pretty close to this photo etch layout guide that I made. There were some traces cut and rewired as the design was forced to change, but you get the picture. I also forgot to get pictures of the audio amp and synth board. You can sort of see it here. It was kind of cool as I stacked the little Sam QFN breakout onto it from the other video and stashed regulators and MIDI interface under it. I haven't made an audio amp board for many years, so it was a bit of a relearning experience. So anyways, without further ado, here's the finished project in action. The software has several moods to choose from, which will somewhat bias the selection of the next song to play. If Christmas mood is selected, then all songs will play, but heavily sprinkled with Christmas songs. Or if musical is selected, then play will quite often be songs from musicals. The main goal was to prevent the same song from playing again until all the songs have played. This can take quite a while because there are like hundreds of songs. Each one had to be recorded in real time and was most time-intensive part of this project, I believe. I used the Reaper software to tweak some of them if they didn't sound right, because some people use different instruments in different ways. And all synths, even GM synths sound somewhat different. After recording in over 200 songs, though, I accidentally shorted the motherboard with a screwdriver in the worst possible place, right where the 12 volts is turned into 3.3 volts, which of course fried the two flash EEPROMs, killing everything I had recorded in for 4 days. Luckily, I had backed up the first 100 songs, so only had to cram a couple of days after that. It was a real stupid thing to do in any case. A grade 3 student knows not to stick a metal object into something that's powered on. Jesus. So back to selecting moods. If Melisma mood is selected, the piano will attempt to compose its own melodies based on progressions I programmed in, the same way you would a normal Melisma module. The Melisma mode will also modify existing songs and note limits with note limits and note mirror like in the Sequarallel module. At the entry into a self-composition, most parameters are randomly selected within, ranges. These include program number, root and chord progression lists, progression list windowing, left-hand waveform type or sequence, the arpeggiation's hold sequence, and clock timing, arpeggiator mapping, which now the Melisma has, master clock, gate on sequence, instruments, LFO frequencies, and a whole bunch of other parameters. The sound quality is pretty decent, and I would recommend the SAM2695 synth chip to anyone that wants a mobile unit with GM or a retro gamer rig perhaps. Besides the standard vibrato, reverb and echo, and 4-band EQ if you want to dig a bit deeper, there's not a lot of effects to use on the SAM2695. I was fairly annoyed they hadn't added CC74 and 71 for cut and res control. That's a real game changer. But the EQ can be somewhat of a substitute for this. Like I said, a great portable general MIDI synth, really. I hope you have enjoyed this construction video. It was an interesting experience, and I know my parents are gonna love it. I'm Sandy Sims. All the best for 2021 to everybody out there. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.